Good morning. Before we look at the parable of the talents, I'd just like to pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together with you and your word. As we read and hear your word, may your Spirit help us see and understand what you have for our minds and hearts to learn. Amen. This morning we will be looking at the parable of the talents. And parables are one of the simplest forms of fabricated stories, fictitious. A parable includes a setting, describes an action, and shows the result of that action. It often involves a character facing a moral dilemma or making a questionable decision and then suffering the consequences of that choice. Like a fable, a parable generally relates a single, simple, consistent action without too much detail or distracting circumstances. However, parables differ from fables in that fables use animals, plants, inanimate objects, and forces of nature that often have magical endings, whereas a parable features human characters in a realistic story that seems probable and takes place in the familiar setting of life. Jesus did not invent the parable, though he used them extensively in his teaching, as they were used in the Old Testament, in 2 Samuel, Isaiah, to mention just a couple of references. And they were a recognized story form that was already being used in his culture and that he simply borrowed. Jesus used the 35 to 40 parables. There's much debate about how many parables there actually are in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to help his followers grasp spiritual truths. He was building a bridge from the natural to the spiritual. In the book, The Complete Guide to the Parables, Dr. R.T. Kendall says that telling parables was Jesus' way of helping people to make the transition that each of us make every day of our lives, to move from the natural level of life to the spiritual level of life. The parable of the talents, or the bags of gold, as it's called in our Pew Bibles, which, by the way, is Matthew 25, 14 to 30, and it's page 915 in your Pew Bibles, is one of 16, and I encourage you to get that out. We will be referring to it later. It's one of the 16 parables in Matthew, and is one of a number that describes what the kingdom of heaven is like. The first parable in the same chapter, Matthew 25, starts with, "At the time the kingdom of heaven will be like," and then the parable of the talents at verse 25 begins with, again, "It will be like," it being the kingdom of heaven. I'm actually going to read from another version, the Message, as it uses language that often makes the meaning of a passage more easily understood, but I think you'll still be able to follow along in the Pew Bibles. Matthew 25, 14 to 30. "It's also like a man going off on an extended trip. He called his servants together and delegated responsibilities. To one he gave $5,000, to another $2,000, to a third $1,000, depending on their abilities. Then he left. Right off, the first servant went to work and doubled his master's investment. The second did the same. But the man with the single $1,000 dug a hole and carefully buried his master's money. After a long absence, the master of those three servants came back and settled up with them. The one given $5,000 showed him how he had doubled his investment. His master commended him. 'Good work. You did your job well. From now on, be my partner.' The servant with the $2,000 showed how he also had doubled his master's investment. His master commended him. 'Good work. You did your job well. From now on, be my partner.' The servant given $1,000 said, 'Master, I know you have high standards and hate careless ways, that you demand the best and make no allowances for error. I was afraid I might disappoint you, so I found a good hiding place and secured your money. Here it is, safe and sound down to the last cent.' The master was furious. 'That's a terrible way to live. It's criminal to live cautiously like that. If you knew I was after the best, why did you do less than the least? The least you could have done would have been to invest the sum with the bankers, where at least I would have gotten a little interest. Take the 1,000 and give it to the one who risked the most. And get rid of this play it safe, who won't go out on a limb. Throw him out into utter darkness. As this parable is a description of the kingdom of heaven, who might the man going on a journey be? Karen got it. God. And what does he do before he goes? He calls his servants together. And who are his servants? Yes, Justina. Us. We are. The man's purpose for calling the servants together was to delegate responsibility for his wealth to them while he's away. And he does so according to each person's ability. The master, or God, he's the one who calls the meeting, not the servants. He initiates the delegation of responsibility, decides who gets what, and knows each person's abilities. We are all called by God to use what he has given us to build his kingdom, but that call can be as different as each person in this sanctuary. How many nurses are there here today? Hands up high. That's a lot of nurses. How many of you do exactly the same job exactly the same way? No, none. And you couldn't even if you tried, because you are unique and your calling is unique. So if we are called, why did the servants receive different amounts of the man's property? Well, it's because the man gave according to each person's ability. Though today's New International Version, which is our Pew Bibles, and the Message use gold and dollars to describe what the man gives to the servants, most versions of the Bible use the word talent, which comes from the Greek word talanta, which was a very large sum of money. It was worth over 20 years of a laborer's wages then, and $100,000 by today's standards. There's a long-standing debate about whether this parable is about money, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, or just our natural talents and abilities. And in many ways, it doesn't matter, because the main principle of the story is that each servant was given according to his ability. In this case, the ability to be responsible for the use of whatever God has given us. If you have been given a lot of natural ability in a certain area, then don't be surprised if God gives you great responsibility to use it for his glory. God knows what we can do, and, unlike the world, he'll never promote us past our level of competence. How often do we say to ourselves, "There's nothing I can do for God"? If that question comes from a place of not knowing what God has given you to do for him, then this church can help you. If that question comes from a place of knowing what you can do but are too afraid or lazy to do it, then this church can help you. In Genesis, there's the story of Joseph, a Jew, who was betrayed by his brothers and became the prime minister of Egypt, second only in power to the Pharaoh. Joseph had no formal training for that position. If he had gone into an employment agency and they had asked him to list his skills, he would have said, "Well, I can interpret dreams." He could have convinced himself that there was nothing he could do for God. He was young, he'd been betrayed by his family, he was in a foreign land, and apparently had one talent. After giving one servant 5 talents, another 2 talents, and the third one talent, the man went on his journey. Are we told how long he's going for? Is that mentioned in the parable? No. It's probably safe to assume that it was going to be for some time, or he wouldn't have bothered to delegate responsibility for his assets. We're also not told when the man was going to come back, so another safe assumption is that the 3 servants didn't know either. The first 2 servants immediately did something with what they were given. They had a sense of urgency. They went at once to work. They didn't question their master's faith in them. They didn't question their abilities, but they set out to make as much money for him as possible in the time they had. The money was on loan. They had it for a short time, and they were going to make the most of it. What did the third servant do? Where did he put the money? In the ground. You can tell Justina's been in Sunday school. This man was a risk-free zone. He didn't even try a mutual fund or a GIC. What makes a person who's been given money to make more money bury it? Fear. And we all know fear. We know the immediate fear of seeing something happen in front of us and not being able to stop it, like a child who's falling, and suddenly the movement slows down, and you know that a chin and a piece of pavement are going to have a very uncomfortable meeting, and you can't do anything about it. And you probably know the long-term fear of anticipating an exam or an interview or a presentation that you have to make at school or work. I can still remember my whole grade 5 class competing in a public speaking contest in our homeroom. I felt sick for 3 days leading up to it, and my legs shook so badly while I was speaking that I had to hold on to the podium. I'm doing much better today. Then there's the fear brought about by the big decisions of life: what to study, where to live, who to marry. Fear can be a sick, sick thing. A week before Rob and I got married, I decided I was going to call the wedding off. I made the rather misguided decision that it would be easier to have loved him for a little bit and say goodbye now than get married and love him for a long time and not know when I was going to have to say goodbye. And this was a real fear. I was frozen with this fear. I shared this with my mother, who had my wedding planned with military precision. She said, "That's silly." My mother's British. She was right, and in sharing my fear with her, I was able to gain another perspective. God gave Rob to me, and my fear could have stopped me from entering into the most life-changing relationship of my life, other than the one I have with God. Fear freezes us, immobilizes us, lies to us, and makes us bury what God has given us. You may have 1 talent, and you may have 5. But if you're too scared to use them, if you choose to bury them, it doesn't matter what they are or how many you have. They are useless to God. And what God gives us, He expects us to use. We make God happy when we use what He's given us. We, who are mere human beings, can make God happy. This is incredible. We can see this in the master's response to the first 2 servants. It's in verse 21 of the passage. It reads, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness." This is an enthusiastic response, as can be seen by the use of 2 exclamation marks. And he gives the 2 servants the same commendation. Even though they had responsibility for different amounts of money, he praised them exactly the same way. Is the master happy about the money that has been made? Is that what's making this master happy? Justine is shaking her head vigorously. No. What is he happy about? What is making him happy? They took a chance. They were faithful. They used what he gave them. Given what we know about the worth of a talent in today's money, I find it interesting that the master says to both of servants 1 and 2 that they have been faithful with a few things. Obviously, the money meant little to him. He was so wealthy that what he had loaned to the servants probably made very little difference to his bottom line financially. But their faithfulness made him happy. And he wanted them to share in his happiness, which in the message is translated as, "From now on, be my partner." If God is really asking us to partner with him, then how must he feel when we bury and don't use what he gives us? Now it's number 3's turn. He says to the master in the message, "Master, I know you have high standards and hate careless ways, that you demand the best and make no allowances for error. I was afraid I might disappoint you, so I found a good hiding place and secured your money. Here it is, safe and sound, down to the last cent." How can we tell that fear has truly gripped this man? Because he doesn't make sense. Firstly, the other 2 servants didn't appear to see their master this way. They were proud to have been entrusted with what they were given and seemed to eagerly rise to the challenge. Secondly, as we see in the master's response, the least the third servant could have done was put the money in the bank, a risk-free option that would have still made the master something. Number 3, the servant, tries to justify not taking responsibility for what he had been given and seemed to think he could out-talk the master when the final showdown came. The master seems truly upset by the third servant's behavior. In your version, in the Pew Bible, he addresses the servant as wicked and lazy. Wicked and lazy. In the Message, he says, that's a terrible way to live. It's criminal to live cautiously like that. If you knew I was after the best, why did you do less than the least? And then the passage in the Message ends with the master saying, take the 1,000 and give it to the one who risked the most, and get rid of this play it safe who won't go out on a limb. Throw him out into utter darkness. For servant number 3, the result of not doing anything with what he was given was, first of all, the removal of what he was given, which was then given to the one who had already had the most and had risked the most. And then it was his own removal from his master's presence. I don't believe we can lose our salvation by not using what God has given us, but we risk far more by not using our talent than when we do use it, for we risk disappointing God. God's world is different from ours. Our inherent limitations as believing humans places us between the two worlds. Our world says some are winners and some are losers. God's world says you have to choose to be a loser because he sets you up to win, to please him, to be a part of his expanding kingdom. Truly, the risk is not taking a risk. As Rob admonished us last week, we have to go out from here. The church is the only club that exists for its non-members. If we don't leave here, no one will come in here. If we don't risk speaking and acting in love in the world out there and telling people why we behave the way we do, our world will be condemned to darkness, just as the worthless servant was. When the Spirit speaks, we must listen and then act. He may use a little whisper that nudges you to say hello to someone new, or he may choose an illuminated flashing sign that says, "Go this way now." Your responsibility is to obey, to use what God has given you. What happens after that is God's responsibility. A few months ago, I could have said that and have been somewhat removed from what it might mean in actual everyday life. But in 10 days' time, I won't have a job, and in a month's time, I'll be a student again. I don't know what I'm going to do with a master's in spiritual formation, but I do know that I have to take responsibility for what God has given me, including the opportunities, and the rest is up to him. I've decided it would be a greater risk to not go back to school. So, what risk are you going to take this week, this month, this fall? How do you hope to make our God happy? And in response and in preparation for the communion service,